All right, this is American History, Unit 2, Lecture 6, Creating the Constitution. This is going to be the second PowerPoint lecture in Chapter 5. Calling for Convention. So, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton urged a meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation. They, along with a lot of other people, understood that the Articles of Confederation was very weak. Of those weaknesses, I listed in the first PowerPoint slide, and and along with a lot of other people, understood that the Articles of Confederation wasn't all that good. Shays' Rebellion was basically a tipping point that pushed people and convinced the states to attend this new convention. Okay, George Washington does agree to attend this convention, this meeting. So this meeting is legitimate because he is obviously a respected individual, war general from the American Revolution. All of the states attend or have representatives in attendance except for Rhode Island. In all, there were 55 men that met in a hot spring and summer months of 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So the ground rules were set. Everything would be kept in secret. There would be one vote per state and majority rules. So even though there were 55 men, if there were, let's say, 10 men from North Carolina would only get one vote. Okay, so all 10 of those men from North Carolina, for example, would have to agree upon whatever they were voting on at the meeting or convention. The government would be rewritten. Going into this meeting, though, they thought that they were going to revise the Articles of Confederation. They thought that they were going to change some things. However, they realized that the Articles of Confederation needed to be thrown out completely, which is what they did from the beginning. So the biggest issue at what would be known as the Constitutional Convention would be representation in government, or big states versus little states. So during the summer months of 1787, spring and summer months of 1787, two plans for government start to surface. The first plan was called the Virginia Plan. It was mostly written by James Madison, who was from the state of Virginia, and him and his constituents, or his people, or his other delegates, said that the plan for government, we should have 3 branches of government, and that Congress should be bicameral, meaning Congress should have 2 houses, and that in order for representation to be based upon, people should be counted. So basically, population would be based upon representation. The larger states would have more representatives in Congress, and the smaller states would have lesser representatives in Congress. So that's what James Madison's plan was, and his plan was the Virginia Plan, and this was what we would call supported by the big states. So the larger states supported the Virginia Plan, so your New Yorks and your Pennsylvanias. In response to the Virginia Plan, smaller states came up with a plan for government, and their plan was called the New Jersey Plan. William Patterson, he was the main author of this plan, and he and his delegates came up with this New Jersey called plan, because obviously Patterson was from New Jersey. So what did they call for, or what did their plan consist of? Their plan consisted of a single Congress, so unicameral, very similar to the Articles of Confederation, with a group of executives. Okay, so that would be like a maybe 2 or 3 presidents, quote unquote, and they said representation in Congress should be equal, meaning no matter how big or small the state is, each state would have equal representation, meaning 1 vote, 2 votes, 3 votes, however it may be, everybody would have the same amount of votes. And this would be known as the small state plan. Okay, so we see the two plans for government. The Great Compromise. So the issue of representation is solved by the Great Compromise. So what happens is they compromised, and each state would get 2 votes in the Senate, okay, and the number of votes in the House of Representatives would be based upon your state's population. So basically, it's what we have today. We have a bicameral Congress, meaning we have 2 Congress. In Congress, there are 2 houses. One house is called the Senate, which I just told you, and the other house is called the House of Representatives. Today, every state gets 2 votes, and then in the Senate and then in the House of Representatives, you get votes depending upon how large your state is. For example, I believe today North Carolina has either 13 or 15 representatives in the House of Representatives. That means North Carolina is divided up into 13 or 15 different sections, and it's based upon population. So how do we know how many representatives, or how do we know how many people live in the state? Well, a census is taken every 10 years, and that will determine the population. So every 10 years, you could gain or lose people in your state, and thus you will gain or lose representatives in the House of Representatives. So then that's kind of how they decided on this. The stuff that we have today is obviously very similar to the Virginia plan, because we have a bicameral Congress, like I just said, 2 houses, Senate and the House, and then we have 3 branches of government: a legislative branch, a executive branch, and a judicial branch. Also included in the Great Compromise is the issue of slavery. So the southern states wanted to count slaves for representation. Now, this was very hypocritical of them, because they viewed slaves at the time not as people, but as property. But they thought that they could get the upper hand on the northern states, because they realized the northern states did not have very many slaves, and they thought that they could have an upper hand in Congress, more specifically in the House of Representatives, because they said, hey, if we count the slaves as people, then we will have more representatives than the northern states. So the compromise that came out of this, and obviously the northern states did not agree to that because they knew what was going on. The compromise was called the 3/5 Compromise, and it says that for the purposes of representation, 3/5 of a state's slaves would be counted. Okay, so for every 5 slaves, it would count as 3 people for the purpose of population count. They also promised, the Northerners promised the South, that they would not interfere with the slave trade for 20 years. Economic issues. The federal government can now tax and coin money and regulate trade between the states. So this is where they start to adopt some of those things that was left out from the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of the United States that we're now talking about and now developing. Deals with these issues that the Articles of Confederation kind of created. So the Constitution was written, it was hashed out. Now it is time to ratify the United States Constitution. So after they met in the summer of 1787, they wrote out the Constitution. Then each of those 55 delegates took copies of the Constitution back to their own individual states, and they had what was called state conventions or state meetings, and they had to convince the people of their state that this Constitution was a good idea, and they had to vote on it at the individual states. Well, during this time period, and this took months and a couple of years for all states to agree, but when 9 of the 13 states agree and vote on this Constitution, then it will be adopted as the law of the land. So it's not a thing where they just drew it up and then all of a sudden, boom, it was part of our nation. This was a process that they had to go through. So developing at these state constitutions, we have two different groups of people start to emerge. We have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are those who are in favor of adopting the new Constitution that they have written, and they nickname themselves Federalists. Those who were opposed of adopting the new Constitution, didn't like it, they were called Anti-Federalists. And some Federalists, by the name of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, wrote a series of papers called the Federalist Papers. These papers were pamphlets that were written to persuade people that this Constitution was the correct thing to do, that it was going to be better than the Articles of Confederation. Much like the papers of the Common Sense written by Thomas Paine tried to convince people to break away from Great Britain, the Federalist Papers tried to convince the people that the Constitution was a good thing. The debate was over a Bill of Rights. When the Constitution was written, there was no Bill of Rights, meaning there was no rights of the people. That was the biggest argument that the Anti-Federalists had, was there were no rights that were protecting the individual people, because they were afraid that this Constitution was going to be like what Great Britain had done to them earlier, and was going to force them to do things that they didn't want to do, like pay taxes and such. So the Federalists agreed that the Federalists said to the Anti-Federalists, if you guys sign the Constitution and this is adopted, we will write amendments or corrections to the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights for the people. So eventually that did happen, and we will talk about the first 10 amendments or the Bill of Rights to the Constitution here in the next PowerPoint slide.